Okay, for additional literacy time today, I'm going to read an article to you. The reason I'm going to read the article to you and not have you read it, as you can see, it's kind of long. It has a lot of big words, and so I'm going to try and translate it. And it's about the Battle of Yorktown. The last battle of the Revolutionary War. When you're done listening to this video, you have questions on your sheet. These are them, but just they're printed out nicer on your sheet. So I'll be answering these. You might have to play the video back to answer these. Okay. The Siege of Yorktown, also known as the Battle of Yorktown, also known as the Surrender at Yorktown, was basically over a month in 1781. It was September 28th to October 19th. Almost a month. And it was in Yorktown, Virginia. It was on the ocean. And that's a key part of it, because the big British general, one of the main commander, he got trapped there. That's what happened. Now, on Google Classroom, you'll see I have a map of Yorktown. You can click it up, and it enlarges really big, actually. And you can see some of the details about where the location is and what happened. So, it was a decisive victory with the combined force of the American Continental Army, General George Washington, and also French Army troops, led by Marquis de Lafayette and Comte de Rochambeau. That is where we get Rochambeau. That's, yeah. Anyway. And they won over General Charles Cornwallis. Cornwallis at that time had replaced Howe and all these other people, and he was like the major general in charge. The Yorktown campaign and the siege on Yorktown, the fort they built on Yorktown, proved to be the last major land battle of the American Revolutionary War. And the surrender of Cornwallis and the capture of both him and his army, 7,000 troops, prompted the British government to negotiate an end to the Revolutionary War. So, what was the importance of Yorktown? They captured a general and his troops, and it made the British surrender. It was the thing that ended the Revolutionary War. So, in 1780, like 5,000 French soldiers, the French finally decided to, towards the end of the war, help out the colonists, landed in Rhode Island to help out their American allies. And there's a whole lot of reading here, but basically Washington and Lafayette and Rochambeau were all wondering, should they lay siege to New York, which had been captured by the British for a long time, early on in the war. Or what should they do? While they were negotiating this, they got some information. So one of the reasons they thought about laying siege to New York is this guy, Rochambeau, and with his Admiral Comte de Grasse. So we have a few players here, Marquis de Lafayette, Rochambeau, and Admiral Comte de Grasse. Admiral Comte de Grasse came with boats, really big boats, with lots of cannons, so they could pull up and intimidate the British ships that had lots of cannons. So it was a really important fighting tool. So they got some information that that Cornwallis was making a fort on the shore in Yorktown in Chesapeake Bay, which is off of Virginia. And when they got this information, they said, ooh, we're not going to lay siege to New York. We're going to go for Cornwallis and lay siege to his fort in Yorktown. So the French and American armies united at New York City, and they marched south. This was summer of 1781. And those days, that's kind of how you move troops more oftenly. Like sometimes on ship, but a lot of times they walked there. So they started walking there summer of 1781. Obviously, they got there in September. Both armies began moving southward towards Virginia and engaging in tactics of deception. Now, I don't know the details of this, and we might have to open it up more, but they led the British to believe that their movements were going around and that they were going to siege New York. So the British really focused a lot of their materials and supplies on New York, getting ready to defend New York. But however, de Grasse, the French admiral, sailed to Chesapeake Bay, and he arrived there in August. And he brought troops, and he blockaded, which means, cut off, stood there with his big boats ready to shoot cannons, at Yorktown. The Continental Army, though... Okay. Sorry, reading ahead. There's a lot of words here. In the beginning of September, the Admiral Comte de Grasse fought British ships, and these British ships were led by Sir Thomas Graves. And these ships came to relieve Cornwallis and help Cornwallis. But Comte de Grasse won. It's called the victory of the Battle of Chesapeake, because it was in the water off of Yorktown. And this was actually step one of how they won. And this is the next question. How did they win? How did they win? Well, step one of how they won was Admiral Comte de Grasse, with his French ships, sank the British ships that were going to go there and help them out. So the British couldn't think about it. There's no roads. There's no trucks. I mean, they have roads, but it's not like highways. Without his ships, Cornwallis could not get stuff in, and he couldn't get people out. So by sinking the British ships that were helping Cornwallis, they really isolated him. So that was step one. How did they win at Yorktown? Comte de Grasse sunk the British ships in the Battle of Chesapeake. So, no reinforcement or escape by sea for Cornwallis. But he also unloaded a bunch of guns, totally efficient, cannons and stuff, onto the land that he had brought with him from France. So, by late September, Washington and Rochambeau, who walked there from New York, arrived. And the Army and the Navy completely surrounded Cornwallis. So Washington came down around on the land. Comte de Grasse came by on the water. How did they win? They surrounded them. That's how. So the Americans and the French built a parallel and began their bombardment. So a parallel is when somebody builds a fort. You kind of sneak in the middle of the night and you build some lines, some trenches. And they're parallel to who you're fighting. Like they have their wall, and then you build a wall parallel to theirs. That's why they called them parallels. And they were known as a way of taking forts, called siege. With the British defense now weak, on October 14th, Washington sent 2 columns to attack the last remaining British outer defenses outside their fort. A French column took Redoubt number 9. And an American column under Alexander Hamilton, this is what the play is about. There's this whole song about this, before Yorktown. History has its eyes on you, I think it is. Hamilton took Redoubt number 10. Okay, so what is a redoubt? It's got a weird spelling. It has a B and a T. A redoubt. So a redoubt is a fortification. It's kind of like a big mound of sand with big spikes on it and stuff. And usually a cannon and like guys with guns and stuff. So it's kind of like this defensive thing. So when they took these 2 redoubts, they were able to then build another parallel, the colonists were, closer. So what is a parallel? A parallel is a trench you build when you're trying to take over a fort. So, in this parallel, they brought cannons up really close, and they just started shooting their fort, a whole bunch of cannons, and very intensely. So, finally, Cornwallis asked for capitulation terms. Capitulation. Great word. Very British. Capitulation. It means to give up. Needs to surrender. Surrender and give up. So, basically, after 2 days of negotiating, the surrender ceremony occurred on October 19th. Cornwallis did not show. Reminds me of Trump, you know? How he wouldn't show. Anyway, with the capture of more than 7,000 British soldiers, negotiations between the United States and Britain began and finally resulted in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Stuff moved slow back then because of it. You had to move by ship. But the Treaty of Paris was basically that the United States was its own independent country. And it was the surrender, the official surrender, signed by the king and Parliament and everything. So, how did they win? Reviewing a little bit. The French admiral came in and sank the British ships. Rochambeau and Washington surrounded them by land on the other side, and they had them trapped. They were able to take the redoubts, which were these defenses, build parallels, which are trenches that they put cannons in, and basically bombard the fort with cannons. That's how they won. And kind of Cornwallis was surprised, you know? And it was kind of a lucky chess move. Again, you know, we've been reading about, like, they shouldn't have won. But with the Battle of Yorktown, they caught the major commander of all the British forces, and they had his entire army surrender. They were done in the colonies. That really broke it. And remember, they were gentlemen about it. You know, I capitulated, I surrendered. So they keep to their word, unlike the colonists. So the negotiation, the surrender ceremony apparently was like a big deal. There's videos about it. We'll have to watch them. But it's like they opened the doors to the fort. The soldiers came in and laid down their guns while the other soldiers were standing there like this, you know. But they're also really beat up at that point. They were totally done. They weren't going to try anything sneaky. And the British soldiers marched out. What happened to them? We'll have to find out. Okay. What was the importance of Yorktown? It won the war. I'd like a longer answer than that, though. The importance of Yorktown was they seized a moment using their French allies to capture the British very cleverly and expel the British from the colonies. How did they win? Admiral Comte de Grasse came by ocean, sunk the British ships that were supporting Cornwallis. Rochambeau and Washington came around on the other side, and they trapped him. A redoubt is a defensive earth mound built around a fort. That's what the British built. The British built redoubts. A parallel is a trench that you build in front of a fort when you're trying to take over a fort, called siege, that the colonists built and stuck cannons in. Capitulation means surrender. Okay. Have good manners with the guest teacher. If I find out you're not having good manners to the guest teacher, I will not be able to reward you. And we're going to go individual, not class. Okay? So be good. Okay? Hang in there. All right. You have enough now to know about the Battle of Yorktown. You can answer your sheet and look at the map.